Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Taylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest Webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. It will also be available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via our webinars webpage at nuca.com. Next slide. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute themselves and unmute yourself. Question will be asked at the end of the webinar or during as well, too. We might find a few spots where it's more convenient to ask the question then as opposed to holding on to the end. I'm going to leave that up to Zach to make that determination. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read those written questions to our presenter at the conclusion of his presentation. Now let's get started. Today's Webinar Wednesday is about election 2020 and how its results may affect the American utility construction industry over the next 2 and 4 years. A new Congress starts afresh on January 3rd, ending all previous legislation and starting with new bills, including those funding infrastructure. And while we all await the results of the presidential contest, we can make studied inferences about the direction of the next Congress based on last night's results. Our expert presenter today is NUCA's own Zach Perconti, associate at Wyman Associates. Zach has been an invaluable part of the NUCA government affairs team since 2019. He obtained his master's degree in public policy from my old alma mater, George Mason University, and has a degree in history from the College of William and Mary. He has an intuitive grasp on our industry's issues and the congressional campaigns affecting the makeup of the coming 117th Congress. We are very lucky to have Zach working on the NUCA team on behalf of the membership. Thanks so much for joining us today, Zach. I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Bob. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the question on everyone's mind right now is, what happened last night? This was, much like 2016, quite the shock to a lot of folks in the media and in DC. Republicans, it's safe to say at this point, have overperformed across the board. While we won't know the exact extent of how much they've overperformed, especially on the state level, we do know that there's likely to have been a sizable polling miss, especially in a lot of key swing states. So what is the meaning of that? At this point, especially with some breaking news and that CNN and other outlets are now officially projecting that Joe Biden has won Wisconsin, it is likely that Biden is favored to win at least 270 electoral votes. However, with news breaking just before the webinar that the Democrat in Maine Senate race has officially conceded, it's almost guaranteed at this point that we will have a narrow Republican majority in the Senate. What's really surprising is that, contrary to all forecasts, the House will actually shrink in its Democratic majority. Rather than the Democrats adding seats, it's looking like we might see a net Republican pickup of anywhere from 7 to 10 seats. So we can just dive right into the presidential results so far. As you can see right now, the main states that are still up in the air are Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Now, of those states, Arizona has been called by numerous outlets for Joe Biden and is not likely to flip back. While there are still quite a lot of outstanding votes in that state, the majority of them come from blue-leaning areas in Maricopa and Pima counties. It's very unlikely at this point that the president manages to flip Arizona back, so that's safe to add into the blue column. A very similar situation in Nevada. Nevada has not been called yet, but almost all of the outstanding ballots are in Clark County in the Las Vegas area, which leans heavily blue. With those two states, plus Wisconsin, which has been, as I said, called for Joe Biden since we began this webinar, Michigan is also trending heavily blue at this point. Those states give Joe Biden exactly 270 electoral votes, and with that, the presidency. Now, there is still some questions as to what's going to happen. The Trump campaign is filing for a recount in Wisconsin, as the result there is going to be very close. However, As it stands, it's unlikely that they'll be able to flip enough votes in that recount to switch the state. And there are still over 1 million votes left to count in Pennsylvania, where Trump only leads by a sizable margin less than that, frankly, as well as 200,000 votes left to count in North Carolina, where Trump leads by about 76,000. And Georgia has at least 200,000 votes outstanding in left-leaning areas, primarily in the Atlanta metro, and Trump's lead is only about 87,000 there. So we really don't know what's going to happen in those states. And as Bob alluded to at the beginning of the webinar, the election is now moving to the courts. But at this point, it is safe to say that Joe Biden holds the advantage. And it is more likely than not, barring significant movement in the courts or a dramatic upset in Arizona, that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. However, not all is bad news for Republicans. They managed to stop the bleeding in what appeared to be going into the night, a very positive night for the Senate, for the Democrats. Of these swing states that were projected to be either a toss-up or lean Democrat, virtually every single one of them has gone to the Republicans, gone in the Republicans' direction. Specifically, Maine right now, which was lean Democrat before the election, is actually a toss-up bordering on lean Republican, as the Republican nominee, John James, holds a very narrow lead in the state. Now, I will caveat that with the fact that of the outstanding vote in Michigan, virtually all of it is coming from heavy Democratic areas like Detroit or Kalamazoo. And so those areas may be enough to eke incumbent Gary Peters over the line, but that one is turning into a nail biter. And the fact that that has become such a close race is really emblematic of the struggles the Democrats had in the Senate last night. Other significant results: North Carolina has not yet been called for the Republicans, but it's looking right now like Tom Tillis is going to be able to hang on there, if only barely. And just before the webinar, as I mentioned earlier, Susan Collins was officially called as the winner of the Maine Senate election. And when you look at the map, the other elections that the Democrats were targeting as outside chances, like South Carolina, Montana, Kansas, Texas, all of those went Republican and fairly early in the night. The only silver lining for Democrats at this point with regards to the Senate elections comes in Georgia, where they are confirmed to go to at least one runoff in the Georgia special. And depending on how Biden is able to do in Metro Atlanta, they might be able to pull incumbent Republican Senator David Perdue under that 50% line. However, even if that happens, even if they take the vice presidency, we're almost guaranteed to be looking at a 51-seat Republican majority at minimum. So let's get into House results real quick. Going into the election, we were expecting the Democrats to mostly be playing offense, and it turns out they're actually playing defense. Even now, most of these seats that are still outstanding, quite a few of them are trending in the Republicans' direction. While the Republicans aren't going to flip enough seats to take the House, largely due to the Democrats' sizable gains in the 2018 midterms, they are going to substantially shrink the Democratic majority and likely by a margin of 7 to 10 seats. Some significant Democratic pickups right now: North Carolina 2 and North Carolina 6 both flipped, but those seats were already safe because of redistricting. So those were gimmies for the Democrats. The only seats right now that they're looking good to pick up are Georgia 7, which has already been projected, and the 25th District of California. That one is something the Democrats really had their eyes on because they actually lost it in a special election earlier this year after their newly elected freshman incumbent resigned in scandal. They're hoping they're going to be able to pick that one back up, but California takes a while to count all of its mail-in votes, and we might not know for at least a week or two whether or not they've been able to succeed there. Republican pickups right now are really the story of the night. Of a lot of the seats that flipped in 2018, Republicans were able to flip a lot of them back, including 2 seats in South Florida, South Carolina's 1st District, Michigan's 3rd District, Iowa's 1st District, the Oklahoma 5th District, which is primarily around Oklahoma City, the 2nd District of New Mexico, and the headline flip of the night so far, Minnesota's 7th District, which was occupied by House Agriculture Chairman Colin Peterson. So that's a big win for Republicans. They were narrowly favored going into that seat. President Trump won that district by 30 points in 2016. But Peterson had managed to hang on against demographics in that district for a very long time. And a lot of Democrats were hoping he might be able to sneak out a win one more time. Incidentally, in a Biden administration, Colin Peterson might end up on the short list of picks for the Secretary of Agriculture at this point. So I'm actually going to go back to the Senate map now. And I'm just going to use this to talk a little bit about why things went the way they did. So if this map holds right now, with Republicans picking up Michigan, flipping Alabama, and Democrats flipping Arizona and Colorado, the Democrats are going to see a net change of 0 from their current Senate seats, which is really, I mean, that's heartbreaking, frankly, for a lot of folks in the Democratic establishment, because they were very confident in their chances going into tonight. So we won't know exactly why things went the way they did, as I said, until the dust has settled from this election and folks are able to do an autopsy on the results. But from what we can tell now, the Trump campaign was very successful in their push to cut the margins of Democratic support among Hispanic voters, especially in South Florida and Texas, and among African-American voters as well, who may actually be the ones that are giving John James the push over the edge in Michigan. Additionally, one other factor that might have gone in their favor, particularly at the Senate level, is Democratic confidence in a Joe Biden victory may have actually led to an increase in ticket splitting in places like Maine and even in, again, Michigan, where folks, and especially North Carolina, by the way, where folks, much like some in 2016 did, believe that they want to have a divided government to put a check on Joe Biden and the House Democrats. And, in this case, the election just wasn't as close as a lot of voters, or was much closer than a lot of voters thought. And that may have contributed to a Republican Senate majority being able to hang on. There are a few major Democratic holds that I want to get to before I talk about what this means for the industry. Oregon's 4th district is the one that most Democrats are breathing a huge sigh of relief on. And frankly, we as folks in the utility contracting industry probably should as well. Oregon's 4th district is held by Peter DeFazio, who has been the chair of the House Infrastructure and Transportation Committee for quite some time now. And before he was the chair, he was the ranking member prior to the Dems retaking the House. DeFazio is probably the strongest proponent of reauthorizing the state revolving funds in Congress. He's very friendly and willing to work with NUCA on a lot of different issues. And we actually did support him in his reelection bid. Part of the reason for that is DeFazio is also fairly bipartisan when it comes to House Democrats. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee likes to think of itself as a very bipartisan committee. They prefer to pass bills that are bipartisan in really any climate. And DeFazio has very much made it clear that he intends to continue to do that in the next Congress. Furthermore, the Biden campaign had actually been talking to him prior to the election about what their infrastructure plan might look like in a new administration. So he really holds a lot of the reins in shaping what the infrastructure agenda is going to look like. If he had lost, the Democrat that replaced him might not be as willing to compromise, especially if the Democrats had managed to take the Senate. So a lot of folks are breathing a sigh of relief there. The only other race right now that the Democrats are exhaling on really is Virginia's 2nd district. That was a very competitive rematch between former Representative Scott Taylor and the current incumbent Elaine Luria. It's looking like she's managed to hang on. When it comes to Republican holds, like I said, they're really having a better night than they expected. Illinois' 13th district, which is occupied by Rodney Davis, another friend of NUCA, ranking member on the House Highway Subcommittee of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He's managed to hold on. He was projected to win fairly early in the night, so they're very pleased to see that they were able to hang on. Arkansas's 2nd district had been moved as a late toss-up in the Democrats' column. The fact that the Republicans were able to hold on to that suggests good things for them in keeping a lot of that southern firewall they have intact. And likewise, Nebraska's 2nd district, even though Joe Biden won the electoral vote in that Omaha-based district, Nebraska's 2nd actually was a Republican hold. And that's largely because the former Democratic incumbent of that seat actually endorsed current incumbent Don Bacon, the Republican, over his Democratic challenger. So very interesting dynamic there. It'll be interesting to see how long Republicans can hold on to that seat, but I know that they're very happy to keep that seat right now. Two other major Republican holds. North Carolina's 11th district, 25-year-old Madison Cawthorn, who's been lauded as something of a rising star in the Republican Party, was able to win his campaign over an unexpectedly strong push from Democratic challenger Mo Davis, a retired military officer. And then important to NUCA members, Pennsylvania's 10th district, occupied by Scott Perry, who sits on some of our key committees. It's not projected that he'll win yet, but so far it's looking pretty good for him. Right, so that's a lot of results we've thrown at you. What does that mean? Well, like I said, it looks like we're looking at a divided government. That means there is a little chance that the Democrats are going to pass a lot of the significant messaging legislation that they've introduced in the House and that Joe Biden has campaigned on. Things like tax reform, as they'd put it, or rolling back the 2018 or the 2017 Trump tax cuts, as the Republicans would put it, that's probably dead. Likewise, a lot of the elements of H.R. 2, probably dead in its current form. The PRO Act, the big sweeping labor bill that House Democrats had introduced, that's not going to pass the Senate. One of the most significant developments for the Senate is Puerto Rico actually held a statehood referendum on Election Day yesterday. And prior to past statehood referendums that they held, which have either been boycotted by the opposition for reasons feeling that the language was unclear, or have been arranged in such a way as to favor the pro-statehood vote by dividing the question, or do you support Puerto Rico's current status, and then what status would you like Puerto Rico to have? This referendum used the same language that Alaska and Hawaii used in their successful statehood referendums. Puerto Rico narrowly voted by what looks like about 52% margin to 48% against or so. They have narrowly voted to apply for admission as a state. Now, that referendum is not binding, but the Puerto Rico government does look like it's going to be held by the pro-statehood party. Mitch McConnell has already come out and said in the past that he is not in favor of Puerto Rico statehood. With the Senate in control of the Republicans, it's not likely that that's going to come up for a vote anytime soon. Likewise, DC statehood, it's not even on the table in a Republican-held Senate. And I really don't think that's surprising to anyone at all. So what is that going to mean for the Biden administration? Well, they're really going to have to focus on bipartisan solutions to get anything done. And the big question there is, to what extent will a Republican Senate work with the Biden administration? And frankly, if Joe Biden does manage to win the election, as it looks like he might now, that's not really a question anybody but Mitch McConnell knows the answer to right now. We all know that there have been some nasty partisan confirmation fights in the past. And it remains to be seen if those are going to extend to things as ordinarily relatively uncontroversial as a lot of cabinet posts. We might be looking at a situation where cabinet secretaries either don't get hearings, or they all end up like those very contentious Betsy DeVos hearings that we saw back at the beginning of President Trump's term. So there are a lot of questions right now about what a Biden administration's relationship with the Senate would look like. And it really remains to be seen if Joe Biden's ability to work with moderate Republicans that he touted on the campaign trail is as strong as he thinks it is. What does that mean for our advocacy efforts is really the question that we should get into here, though. NUCA's 2021 legislative strategy is going to have to adapt. Divided government was a possibility that we anticipated when we drew up the plan, but it wasn't the easiest possibility in terms of getting some of those big bills that we wanted done. There was a lot of stuff that we were a little ambivalent on, to say the least, in H.R. 2, but there was a lot of stuff in there that we did support, and it's not going to get passed as one big sweeping package. That does present the opportunity for us to work with lawmakers on smaller bills that tackle specific NUCA priorities, but it really depends on what the climate is going to be in Congress, and it remains to be seen just how hostile the relationship between the House and the Senate is going to be. If we can get movement on those, then our priorities are largely going to be the same. We're going to focus on private activity bonds, which we know that the Democrats are already pretty strongly in favor of. And we're going to focus on SRF reauthorization, much as we have over the last 2 years. This approach would likely go back to what we were doing on bills like H.R. 1497, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act. That was a big four bill that we got through the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee without really much heavy lifting. But it was never brought up to a vote in the full House because they didn't have a way to pay for it. Now that we're in a situation where they're going to have to negotiate with Mitch McConnell, almost certainly, they're going to have to answer that question. And as a result, SRF reauthorization levels are not going to be the $40 billion type deals that we were looking at in a bill like H.R. 2. They're much likely to be more like 14 billion or even 7 billion, which was one number put forward by the Senate earlier on in negotiations last year. Likewise, broadband expansion funding is another thing that it's not going to be the huge windfall that a lot of Democrats were proposing. One of the numbers in H.R. 2 for broadband expansion was 80 billion. That's very unlikely to get past the Senate, although there is more appetite for expanding rural broadband among Republicans than there is for certain other infrastructure investment, especially given the very real need for it that's been demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But it really depends to what degree Mitch McConnell is willing to work with the Biden administration and to what degree House Democrats are going to be willing to compromise with Senate Republicans. There is a very real chance that Biden is going to have to do a lot of stuff through executive order if he wants to advance Democratic priorities. And what that means for NUCA is we're probably going to be playing quite a bit of regulatory defense, frankly. There are a number of Trump administration regulatory reforms on issues like, for example, hours of service and the short haul exemption that NUCA worked very hard to advance over the last 4 years. A lot of those are going to be up for review if Biden does manage to take the Oval Office. And it really remains to be seen just how many of those he intends to overturn. The one bipartisan bill that I can state with some degree of confidence that it looks like we will get relatively easily is pipeline safety legislation. And that's because PHMSA authorization has already expired. They really don't have a choice but to come to some sort of agreement. And House Democrats were already planning on working with Senate Republicans in the lame duck to try to get a deal done. Now, the question mark that had hung over that was, well, what sort of leverage do they think they're going to have in January? Because if they know they're going to take the Senate come January 3rd, then they really didn't have any incentive to take a deal that was less than 100% for them. Now that Mitch McConnell's continued control of the upper chamber is all but assured, Democrats are going to have to come down to some sort of agreement with Senate Republicans, and that's likely to be something that we're going to be actually quite happy with. The details are going to be worked out, and this lame duck period is certainly going to be a very interesting one, but we should have some sort of idea what it looks like in the relatively near future. While we're on the topic of the lame duck, there are two main agenda items on the list of priorities that they're going to have before either a Biden inauguration or what is still a possibility of a Trump second term, but again, rapidly fading. The two things they absolutely have to get done. Number one, government funding is set to run out again on December 11th. They need to get some sort of deal done. Now, if President Trump knows that by that point he's not going to have a second term, it's unclear as to what degree he would play hardball in those negotiations. There were previously reports that he still wants additional funding for a border wall, that if he knows he's not going to get a second term, well, that is one of his, the things he touts as one of his accomplishments and one of the main parts of his agenda. There may be a funding fight over that where he's unwilling to compromise on it, especially because the Republicans are likely to still control the Senate in January. So it's not like the Democrats can just pass whatever they want when they take, the Biden inauguration hypothetically happens. The other big thing that needs to happen at some point is COVID-19 stimulus legislation and relief legislation. I know that a lot of folks on Capitol Hill are very unhappy that they haven't been able to get a deal done. There's certainly a lot of public pressure to get some sort of deal done on them. I think that part of the degree of the turnout in the election, we saw in the exit polls pretty consistently that the number one and number two issues for folks, number one was the economy, number two was the coronavirus pandemic. Both of those definitely point to a very continued strong public demand for some sort of stimulus relief. The main hangup is what it was before the election, which is they just can't come to a funding agreement. Mitch McConnell and President Trump still want a number that's lower than what Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats want. Mitch McConnell's number is lower by quite a lot than what President Trump wants. Part of that is due to the fact that a lot of the Senate Republican caucus is concerned about the deficit and concerned that we've already added too much to it with the last legislation, and they want to continue to see if the economy will continue to recover on its own. But it's a big question mark as to whether or not they're going to be able to get a deal done. And now that it doesn't look like there's going to be a Democratic Senate in January, it looks like Mitch McConnell is going to keep that chamber. That situation is not really going to change much, even if Biden does manage to take the White House. So there are a lot of things that we don't know still, frankly. We do know that at this point, as I said, unless the election is adjudicated in the courts and President Trump gets some substantial decisions in his favor, it looks like Biden will win the Oval Office. He may win it with as little as 270 electoral votes, which gives him no room for faithless electors or any of the quirks of the Electoral College. And if something like that happens, we're in completely uncharted waters. But it doesn't look great right now for President Trump. If I had to be one of the two men, I would rather be Joe Biden at this point. And I think that a lot of the folks, even in the Trump camp, are starting to come to that same conclusion. A Trump defeat, however, for Republicans is a lot of the sting is taken out of that by the fact that they've managed not only to convincingly keep the Senate, but to really beat back the Democratic odds of keeping such a strong majority in the House. And that really bodes well for them in 2022 under a Biden midterm. So we're in for a very interesting couple of years, and NUCA will be at the forefront of tracking what's going on and advancing our agenda. But, we might be in a situation where we don't have more clarity on this until mid-November. That's kind of my general overview. We do have some time for questions if folks are interested. There are still results coming in. There is still the risk that things could be called during our webinar. If stuff is called, I will share that with you during the Q&A. But it is, right now, everything has been called for Joe Biden officially other than Michigan. So we're really just waiting for an official call on Michigan to start seeing organizations make a final final projection that Joe Biden will win the White House. So, questions?
Thank you, Zach. You did an absolutely marvelous job on that. You brought up a few things that I wasn't even aware of, especially when it comes to Puerto Rico and what was happening with that. And you also brought up as well, too, what we're all going to be facing over the next couple of weeks when the little-known electoral college process kicks in. I've been reading so much about, Democrats, causing havoc within that process. Well, there's also the Trump campaign could do the exact same thing as well, too. So that's another thing that we all get to, as Americans, we end up getting to watch. Before we end up opening to questions, I was hoping that our Pennsylvania chapter director might end up joining us and giving her observations on what she sees in Pennsylvania. One of the great things about having a webinar like this is that we bring in industry experts from everywhere, not just Zach and our government affairs office, but also as well, too, from those who are on the ground who actually see this in a way that we in Washington just don't have that sort of vision. Brenda, if you want to unmute yourself, you don't want to, that's fine as well, too. But you brought up a few questions I thought were interesting in terms of where Pennsylvania is going with their particular counts and what that might do for the overall process.
No, I'll just give you a quick rundown. The two seats that we're really watching here is the Scott Perry race. He is ahead according to the Election Bureau. There's good percentage. There's like another 25% to come in, and we don't know. I don't know exactly where those votes are coming from. If I knew that in more detail, I would be able to, say, oh, that's a Republican area or Democratic area, but I don't have those numbers like I used to when I worked in the Senate.
Right.
But that's one that we're definitely watching there. Lloyd Smucker won here in Pennsylvania, which is great. Guy Rushenthaler, D.T. Thompson, John Joyce, and Fred Keller all pulled off their races, which was great. We do have a race that's kind of a bit of a nail biter with Connor Lamb and Sean Parnell. Sean is ahead right now. Taking Connor Lamb's seat would be fabulous for us here in PA. I understand Sean Parnell has a really good background and has a good shot. But again, I don't know. That's a Democratic area out there in the Allegheny County, Pittsburgh region. So there's about, I think, 56% of the vote that's in at this point. I think there's like 85% is collected. I think it's something like that. So we're getting closer to getting that finalized. So those are the two key races at the congressional level for Pennsylvania. I'm sure some other folks have some stuff too that they're following. That's my update.
Thank you, Brenda. Are there any other questions? You can either unmute yourself, or you can certainly type them in and send them to me, NUCA host.
Bob, this is Doug Carlson. First, I want to say real quickly, congratulations to all the chapters for everything you've done, and to, barring some hanging Chad that's out there, we are happy to report that our NUCA PAC is 100% in electing those candidates that we supported financially. As Brenda mentioned, there are a couple in Pennsylvania, but we're happy to present that we were 100% winners of our PAC that we supported.
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that Congressman Muser, who we did support, won his election as well.
Thank you, Doug. That's an impressive stat too, for any PACs our size. Are there any other questions? We have the experts here. We're more than willing to chat with you about this. And we're still in the middle of this and trying to figure out, what's next. Or we can always just open it back up to Zach for a little bit. If you have anything else you want to share at this point, any updates, perhaps, since we started this webinar 34 minutes ago.
This is Brenda again from Pennsylvania. I did have that one question about, I thought the D's had already taken Arizona. Is there a chance that could flip R yet? Zach?
So there is a very small chance. It is very unlikely. The issue is with Arizona, there is still quite a bit of ballots that have not yet been counted. And some of those returns have been good for the president. The problem that they're primarily up against is the majority of ballots that have yet to be counted are in Democratic areas of Pima and Maricopa counties. It's very telling that Fox News and the Associated Press, as well as a couple of other organizations who have called Arizona, have not yet retracted that call. And in fact, they've actually posted articles doubling down on their assessment. Contrast that to the 2000 election, where Florida was at first projected and then retracted as too close to call. We're kind of at that stage where if Arizona was a potential flip back to the Republican column, we would likely know. This is one of those reasons why I almost wish that our webinar was an hour or two later, because if it was, we might have more clarity on what's going on in Arizona. Because there are a few time zones behind us here in DC, they're a little further behind in the counting process today. But right now, the votes that are out, it's not impossible, but it would be statistically improbable for Trump to make up the ground that he needs to flip that state back. And that's why, even with us not knowing the result in Pennsylvania yet, not knowing the result in Georgia yet, and not officially knowing the result in North Carolina yet, although it does currently look like that's still going to go the president's way. Even without Georgia and Pennsylvania, we can all but predict it's looking like Biden is going to take exactly the votes that he needs to win the White House. A Biden victory with 270 electoral votes would be one of the tightest margins in American history, but contrast, a little interesting development, actually. Joe Biden now has officially the most votes of any presidential candidate in American history. And just to show you how high turnout has been in this election, Donald Trump has the third most votes of any candidate in American history. And that's through the roof.
Yeah, it's Bob again. It was a Washington Times article this morning that said our turnout looks like it's going to be 66.1%. Which would be the highest turnout in American history. The last time we got over 60% was 61% in 1964 in the Johnson Goldwater campaign. So, I mean, it says good things about America that, we've got, millions, 130 million people who want to participate in the process. Just wish it was maybe a little bit clearer at the end, but. Are there any other questions? We also want to be respectful of your time as well, too.
Well, I'm sorry, can I just have one other interesting little tidbit? I'm just looking at the map from the Pennsylvania Election Bureau and Philadelphia Inquirer's using their information here. But they're showing Wilkes-Barre red, which is very interesting. Now, Scranton is blue. That's where Biden's hometown is. But Wilkes-Barre, which is coal country, Marcellus shale gas. The other day when everyone was there, Biden and Trump were there. Trump, I don't want to say I don't want to call them protesters because they weren't protesting, but they were all along the streets with their signs to let Biden know this was Trump country. It was interesting.
Yeah, the amount of support, just emotional support coming out from both campaigns this election season was just absolutely amazing. I've never seen it before, and I've been doing this for 20-some years. When this election is not over, there's the statistical side, and we're certainly going to end up entering a phase that we all saw in 2000 with the courts ruling on it. And it seems for this particular campaign, we're going to not just see that in one state, like we saw in Florida, we're probably going to see it in multiple states. What those arguments are going to be, I'm sure the lawyers right now are fathoming what angles they need to take. And of course, on the other side, how that's going to be defended and where it goes, most likely, this sort of thing winds up in the Supreme Court. So we can see interesting decisions again, one way or the other, before, let's say, the 1st of December, or when does the Electoral College meet? I think it's the 14th of December. States. It's mandated by the Constitution. I think that's the date. I think it's the 14th. If you're interested on our election page, NUCA.com/election2020, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce put together an excellent guide in terms of what happens after the election with all the dates that we have to worry about in terms of the states doing for electors, and also when they send those results to the House to be counted as well, too. So there are all sorts of machinations that we haven't seen in 20 years. And at other times, since the early part of our country, look back at the election of 1800 and what happened there and what it caused was two constitutional amendments being added to our big document. If there are no other questions, we're at 40 minutes in. I want to be respectful of people's time. If there's nothing else, Zach, do you have any concluding remarks you want to make?
Well, I do want to just piggyback real quick on what you just brought up with the courts, and that is, you should know that the Trump campaign has already filed lawsuits in Wisconsin and Michigan, and are pursuing legal action in a number of other close states in order to, as you said, take this into the courts. I think that given the margin of Joe Biden's lead in Wisconsin and what appears to be Michigan, now that the last of the Republican counties in Michigan do appear to be in, I do think that is unlikely to succeed. I think that he's going to, much like 2016, we're going to find ourselves in a similar situation with a few thousand votes or tens of thousands of votes being enough to put Joe Biden over the edge in Michigan and Wisconsin. Pennsylvania is still a big question mark. There are quite a number of outlets that are very bullish on that state for Joe Biden based on the remaining returns that are primarily mail-in ballots from Democratic cities. But if Joe Biden has won Arizona, as it appears, and has won Michigan and has won Wisconsin, anything beyond that for him is just padding the lead. And if he does take Georgia, which he might still, or Pennsylvania, then legal challenges won't be enough to tip the election back into the president's column. So we're in for a very interesting week. Stay tuned. NUCA will be providing communications once the race has been officially called and one of the two candidates has conceded. We will know more in the coming days and weeks, but this election is not over. And even the Senate elections are still not over. So do keep an eye out on those.
Zach, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our guests. You made me think about a lot of stuff I hadn't thought about before. And you and I have been talking about this back and forth for the past 3 days. We'd also like to thank our national partners for their kind support of NUCA and our educational webinar series. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. A recording of this webinar will also be made available on the NUCA.com website and on our YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for Webinar Wednesday and supporting NUCA. Our next NUCA Webinar Wednesday will be held December 2nd, sponsored by National Trench Safety. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.